Okay, thanks for joining us, everyone, to the second of our seminar series, or webinar series, I should say, on drought and wellbeing. Tune in and tune up. My name's Andrew Coughlin and I head up the Emergency Services program here in Australian Red Cross. Good to have you all with us here this morning and looking forward to a really interesting session. The first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. In my case, I'm here in Melbourne, coincidentally in one of the suburbs that's being locked down at midnight tonight. So that's another piece of disaster in action. And from my perspective, it's the people of the Kulin Nation. To their elders past, present and emerging, I pay my respects, and likewise to the elders of the various lands on which each of our panellists and participants are joining us today. As I mentioned, for those who joined a moment or two ago, this is the second in the 5-part series that Red Cross is facilitating as part of our drought program, our drought support program, and we're focused very much on people's wellbeing. What we acknowledged last time was that it's been a particularly tough time recently, obviously for people impacted by drought. In many communities, that's been further accentuated by the bushfires that ran through the country over the summer period and into the autumn, and in fact back as far as spring last year. It's been quite a long haul in terms of those bushfires, and again more recently impacting the whole of the country, and indeed globally we've had the impacts of COVID. A lot of people, I think, in that circumstance have considered that drought is no longer an issue. It's not getting the public profile that it once had, but those of us who are involved in either working in support, and particularly those living in those communities, it's clearly a major issue that continues to bring challenges to people. And dry conditions persist far past any, drought-breaking rains, as they're often described in the media across the country. We're still seeing dry conditions in much of the country and much of those affected areas. So as part of the drought program, we're facilitating these 5 webinars where our aim is to bring together quite a diverse group of speakers to support us to work within our own communities, to manage our own work, ourselves and our loved ones during these tough times. The first of the webinars a couple of weeks ago now looked at stress theory and maintaining wellbeing through prolonged stress, and a recording of that can be found on the Red Cross webpage. If you just type in Red Cross Drought Program, you'll get a link to that. A couple of technical things just before we get underway this morning, just to let you know that we will be recording this session and it will be made available on our webpage a little later, so you can share it with others or revisit it if there are things that you missed or that you want to refresh your memory about. We'll have a time for questions at the end, but please ask questions throughout, which we will do via the chat section. You can ask those questions and communicate via the chat box or by clicking on the chat bubble on your screen. We'll get through as many questions as we can at the end of the session, but for any unanswered questions, we'll compile a list and write up those and try and come up with the answers and circulate them at the end of the series. As with all things that we've been experiencing in the last few months with Zoom and other technologies, there's occasionally glitches. Please bear with us if that's the case. We'll be doing our best to deal with them as they occur, if they occur. So enough of the preliminaries. Today we're looking at the drought cycle. So a little bit on cumulative impacts and key considerations at different stages of drought. Then we'll look at the psychology around adaptation in the face of stress and how people can strengthen resilience and manage well-being through a time of ongoing change, both because of the drought and obviously other complicating factors. To do that, we've got 2 speakers with us today. Firstly, Dr. Jacki Schirmer, who is an Associate Professor at the University of Canberra. Jacki leads the Regional Wellbeing Survey that looks at the view of rural Australians about the liveability and resilience of their communities and their wellbeing. And we also welcome back David Younger. For those of you who were with us last time, David was engaged last time. David's a clinical psychologist with a vast array of experience supporting communities throughout Australia affected by natural disasters of various different kinds. So to start over, I'd like to hand now to Jacki, who's going to share share some of her experiences and insights with us. Over to you, please, Jacki.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. I will just see. Soon I'll be able to control the screen. You'll see the slideshow resume in a second, and then we'll get underway. Okay, so I'm here this morning to talk about the drought cycle, and for a lot of people listening, you'll already know all about the drought cycle, but my focus is on understanding the key wellbeing and resilience challenges that we can expect to happen at different stages in that cycle, because sometimes we don't tend to think about that. Just as a starting point, it's useful to reflect on those words wellbeing and resilience, because we quite often we use those words very generally, and people can use them to mean different things. So when I talk about well-being, I'm talking not just about someone's health, but about people being in a state where they can realise their potential, they can cope with normal stresses. Bear in mind, we don't expect people to be able to always cope with abnormal stresses. People are still able to work productively and fruitfully and to contribute to their communities. And that's from the World Health Organization. When I talk about resilience today, I tend to take a quite broad view of it, which is about adapting to adversity and capitalising on opportunities. So a person or a household or a community that's resilient is able to experience adversity and cope with it while it's happening, adapt to it to try and reduce the impacts that it has on their lives. And if any opportunities emerge, they've got the resources and the capacity to actually take advantage of those. And a classic example of that in drought is when we do see some farmers who see some opportunities at points in drought where they may be the one who gets a little bit of rainfall at a key point, which lets them get a fodder crop out and they can get some income out of that. That's an example of that capitalising on opportunities during adversity. So the idea is that we want to build resilience in the longer term, and that helps you maintain your well-being over time. And I'll be talking about more of the community scale perspective rather than the individual perspective. So let's start by thinking about what is the drought cycle. So we often think about this idea of being in drought or not in drought. Lots and lots of people have pointed out that there is no such thing as drought or not drought. What we actually experience is more or less rainfall deficiency at different points in time, and that can go up and down over time. So when we're talking about a cycle, if we're talking about it, we tend to think about there are periods where we've got relatively normal rainfall for a period of time, periods where we have low rainfall that you might not yet classify as drought, but is starting to concern you or cause issues. Once that's been going for a long period, we start to call it drought. And then we get to, after months or years, we get to points where we might have some rain, but not enough to be out of drought. And that's where some parts of Australia are at the moment, and others aren't. And one of the challenges we obviously get there is that many people think as soon as we have rain, we're out of drought, whereas we know that's not the case. Even once we have had extended rains over an extended period of time and we can be classified as being out of drought, that's what we call our recovery and rebuilding phase. We shouldn't think of drought as being over. It takes a long time for many people to rebuild and recover things like income after drought. And then we also have this stage we call preparation for the next drought. That actually can occur at all stages of the drought cycle. So the reason I'm emphasising the drought cycle is because at different points in that cycle, people and communities will have different wellbeing and resilience challenges and different needs for support. Today I'm going to talk very briefly about a lot of them, and in some of the future seminars we'll be unpacking some of those in more detail. But the key thing to also point out is what I think everyone's painfully aware of in 2020, and that is that the impacts of drought obviously mix with the impacts of other events going on at the same time. So every time we're thinking about drought, we need to be thinking, what else is happening? Are people experiencing increased business costs due to changes in the Australian exchange rate? That can be a very big issue for many agricultural and mining communities. Have we had bushfires happening to compound the effects of drought? Have we had storms or frosts or floods? Have we had a pandemic? So we always need to think the drought cycle is not happening on its own. It's interacting with many other things. Okay. Now, the picture I'm putting up now is what we call the hydroecological cycle. It's referring to this concept that the way governments, and I'm not trying to blame governments here, but the way the public responds to drought sometimes can make things a bit more challenging as well as helping. So the hydrological cycle says, here's the typical cycle we see in the public domain. So we're talking here about how the national media represents drought, how sometimes our policy responses respond to drought. And probably the simplest point to start is with let's go with drought. So the challenge here is that in the public discourse, drought is often a really hidden problem at first. So for the first year or two, we often see that the media is not paying much attention to drought. People are experiencing a lot of impacts, but the public hasn't necessarily caught up with that. Even within rural communities, it can be a bit of a hidden problem at first. And that can lead to some people having difficulty or experiencing a bit of stigma in asking for help, particularly early on, and particularly when we sometimes have a lot of people feeling that they shouldn't ask for help until things get really bad. So people are often experiencing a lot of impacts, but the public's not yet recognising that we're actually in drought and experiencing impacts from it. We then often go into an awareness and a concern phase, which is followed by a panic phase. So what you tend to see is some awareness happening, concern, oh my goodness, this has been going on for a long time. And remember, I'm talking about the media here. And then this sort of panicked media coverage, if you like. And those stages are both good and bad in terms of our well-being and resilience, particularly for those who are experiencing a lot of impacts from drought. So at the start with awareness, it can be really good that finally people are aware that we're going through drought. There's some understanding of it. People feel a bit better recognised. Also, we tend to see public support programs coming out from government and charity organisations at this point in the cycle. But sometimes, so that can make you feel less alone, a bit more acknowledged. But then we do get the challenges that come with the sort of high concern and panic phase, which is that very well-intentioned support sometimes doesn't reach the people it needs to. And we do see a lot of concerns about uncoordinated support coming into communities. So people in drought-affected communities experiencing 10 different organisations offering them support, but it's really hard to access. They're not sure which one to go with. It's very confusing. So people want to help, but it's not always reaching where it needs to. The other issue we often see that can impact people's well-being is that some of the media coverage of drought can reinforce their negative feelings or a sense of helplessness about drought. So examples of that are when we see repeated images in the media of paddocks with an unhealthy looking flock of sheep in the middle of them, or a dying or stuck animal in an area at the last little bit of water. We see these very, very negative images. Now, what happens in my group, because we run a wellbeing survey, we quite often get people ringing us up saying, can you do something to try and stop those images, because they're presenting drought-affected communities as not coping with drought and as not taking sometimes good actions about drought. So one of the challenges we've had, and my group certainly works with the media to try and improve the representation of drought and say, as well as those very stark, dire, negative images, we need to present all the things people are doing to cope with drought so that people don't just feel like it's hopeless and everyone is helpless. And also so that we recognise the very constructive and positive things people are doing, such as everything from destocking early and protecting ground cover, to local businesses who have taken out a loan and supporting local farmers. So we need to make sure that we push back on those media stories sometimes so that we don't reduce people's well-being and make people feel more helpless, or also people feel that the massive efforts they're going to in drought-affected communities aren't being recognised. Then after the panic, we get some rain, and suddenly all the attention disappears. And I guess that's part of what we've seen in some areas of Australia this year. Also, obviously, the pandemic and bushfires overtook a lot of the time that sort of space for coverage. And that has certainly led to a lot of people feeling effectively forgotten and isolated. So that's, again, a very important wellbeing challenge. How do we make sure that we support drought-affected communities who may have had some rain, but they're not out of drought yet? Or people who aren't receiving attention to drought, even though they're still experiencing exactly what they were last year when there was a donation tin on the counter of every major city supermarket. So when we're sort of feeling that, it's when we start to feel more isolated again, that can be really challenging to overcome and say, what do we do about that? And then we come to the phase where we've actually had all the rain we need, we're not in drought. The challenge we get at that point is that this is often the time when we're not in drought is often the best time to prepare for the next drought, but we often have limited public support for a lot of funding to support communities in building some of the actions that might reduce the impacts of the next drought. So that's another thing our group certainly works on. So common wellbeing and resilience challenges at different points in the drought cycle. I've talked about most of these, but I'll point out a couple more. When we're in normal conditions, often it's really tempting just to avoid thinking about drought. There's been a few studies done that show, understandably, things are going well, we're enjoying the good times. That's actually protective of our well-being. The one challenge we have is that it's good to also still plan ahead for the next drought. This is a good time when ideally your well-being's a bit better. You can think and make good decisions and plan, and that can help you prepare for the next drought. So sometimes not thinking about drought helps your current well-being, but doesn't necessarily help your future well-being or building that longer-term resilience. When we're in that first stage of there's low rainfall, it's not yet drought, some of the key challenges are that there's so much uncertainty. And that, David, I'm sure will talk more to this, but when we're feeling uncertain about the future, it makes it very difficult to make decisions. And people can sometimes respond by either avoiding thinking about it or worrying about it all the time. It's hard to reach that nice middle ground of being alert but not alarmed, trying to plan to make decisions but not avoid or not spend all your time worrying. So it's a very difficult balance, especially with that uncertainty. By the time a drought's actually declared, usually most people in those drought-affected communities have been experiencing ongoing challenges for quite a while. So we're seeing fatigue and exhaustion, stress, difficulty functioning, and quite often at this stage is when social isolation begins to happen quite a lot. So after you've been experiencing that level of stress for a while, we see a lot of people who say, look, I'm just not able to go out and talk to people, or I've stopped going to community meetings. And that's often associated with difficulty asking for help. And sometimes that big set of public attention that comes in can feel like too much attention. We can't cope because we're so tired and exhausted and stressed that it feels like it's all too much. And we can also have increasing difficulty giving the support we've been giving through drought. Once we get some rain, we've got a lot of hope, but we often get a lot of disappointment. And again, we're back to massive levels of uncertainty and having to make some really hard decisions. Lots of people are making very difficult decisions where they have to effectively take a bit of a gamble. Do we think this rain is going to continue? Do we invest that money in putting in a big crop? Do we invest in rebuilding our stock on the property? When's the best timing to bring in new stuff, in our store, to bring in new supplies? That's really challenging. So support for helping people make decisions can be really critical. And once we've had enough rain to be out of drought, this is actually a period where we need to keep an eye out, because different people, businesses and communities will recover at different rates. One of the biggest things we tend to see in the work we do is some people saying, I feel like I'm the only one who's not actually doing better since the drought ended. I feel like I'm the only one who's still struggling with a lot of debt, or who's finding it difficult to get back to normal life because so much impacted me. The reality is there are a lot of people who will take a long time to recover. So helping address that feeling of being alone and the only one who's not recovering is really critical to supporting people's well-being. It's quite normal to take a very long time for things to recover. So setting realistic objectives about how fast your life can go back to normal is really important. Okay, now I just want to point out that quite often we do tend to focus through the drought cycle on the financial impacts of drought. This is a quick graph from the Regional Wellbeing Survey, and we just simply asked people across Australia who've been impacted by drought, how has drought affected different aspects of your life? And if it's in dark blue, it means it's made that worse. If it's in purple, it means it's made it better. So lots of people, 68%, say, okay, the local landscapes has reduced, it's gotten worse in terms of its attractiveness. We often don't focus on that, but that can impact our well-being quite profoundly when we're living in that landscape. So we do need to think about that. For some people, income reduces, but having a look at that income line, for 8% of people, income actually increases. And that again goes back to some people do get a lucky break during drought. And for a lot of people, income doesn't change. So it's not everyone experiencing the same impacts. For a lot of people, workload increases, and that's actually a really important thing. So the 45% on the workload is actually a bad thing. So that contributes to that exhaustion, that fatigue, and also difficulty accessing support. For a lot of people, time spent socialising with family and friends, which we know is really important to your wellbeing, declines 42%. And along with that, involvement in community organisations. And we sort of see this difference. So we're seeing lots of people having different types of challenges, but also opportunities. For some people, they're able to increase involvement in community organisations. And a lot of people in rural Australia say what makes a difference in drought is how much people in the community support each other. Almost half our communities, people are saying, actually, it was really good during drought, people came together. That's where we see a lot of positives that support our wellbeing. So a lot of our work is looking at how do we unpack when it is that a community comes together versus doesn't. Okay, so summarising some of the things that we know are important at different stages of the drought cycle. When it's normal conditions, investing in planning and preparation and encouraging people to have a talk about what are we thinking about for the next drought, and what people need to think about depends entirely on their individual circumstances. The type of farming you're doing, the type of business you run, the type of employment you have, the sorts of people you might be supporting in a health practice. So this is relevant for all kinds of people in rural communities, but we often see very little support for that sort of investment. When we've got drought ongoing, making sure we have support programs available but also easily accessible. Some of the key barriers are often how accessible those support programs are at first. Often we're just working out the kinks in them just as the rains come. So the better we can do in future droughts in making them accessible more easily earlier on is important. And those support programs should be not just about financial support, but supporting decision making, reducing risk of isolation, and supporting those who are providing support. So what we tend to see is as we get further into drought, the people who've been providing a lot of help to others in their community often struggle more and more. So the classic example of that is the agricultural supply business that might have been extending credit to farmers for 1 or 2 years, and then they finally hit a point, or the local supermarket that finds they're just getting to the point where they can't extend credit anymore. So increasingly we're talking about how do we support those who are providing support and making sure that the help we give communities doesn't bypass local businesses, but actually goes to them. Okay, we've talked about this, but keeping support going after rain comes is critical, and supporting people through that really challenging planning and decision-making phase. How am I going to try and step my way out of drought is a really challenging thing. And then constructive reflection and planning. What worked well, what worked badly when we were experiencing drought last time? What can we learn from that? What are the actions? They're some of the challenges. Okay, I'll skip this slide because I'm going to run out of time. It's saying effectively what I said before, but not everyone in drought affected regions is experiencing the same things. And it's just reinforcing that point that we need to make sure that support to drought-affected communities supports the social networks and the groups in those communities so they can then provide support within their community. So we tend to see debates about that when we see things like people sending direct donations of goods to communities, which can in some circumstances stop people buying from local businesses and cause stress for those local businesses. So we talk a lot about supporting the networks that exist in communities rather than bypassing them as one of the key things we can do to help ensure we're supporting the wellbeing of everyone in drought. Okay, this is my final slide. Some of the things that are emerging in our work, which we'll talk a bit more about in subsequent seminars, are that it's really important for protecting your wellbeing. It's important to both have short-term coping strategies. That means when things are at their worst, knowing how are you going to cope day to day? How do you support others to cope day to day? But also thinking about that longer-term resilience. What are the longer-term changes that may assist in reducing the impact of the next drought? And when we look at those things, we've done a lot of studies with a lot of groups. We find there's a lot of challenges, and a lot of them are around, there's a bit of stigma or a bit of fear around asking for help, taking action when things aren't as dry. So we see people getting criticised once things go back to more rain for taking action to prepare for the next drought sometimes. We also sometimes see people being criticised for doing different things to others or being afraid to do something because it's not something someone's tried before. And we also see people saying, I thought about doing this, but I was worried it might fail, so I didn't. I was worried that the neighbours might think it wasn't the right thing. If we're going to build resilience in the future, especially when we've got really challenging droughts that are different to the ones we've seen before, we need to work on building these healthy resilience cultures. And a healthy resilience culture recognises that it's normal to find it hard to cope. so that it's okay to say, I'm finding it really hard. That's a normal part of this, that it's normal to fail sometimes so that people feel able to try something a bit different. And also recognises there's no one right way to cope with or respond to drought. So those are some of the key things to keep in mind. I'll hand over now to David.
Just before we do, Jackie, a big thank you to you for your input there. Really insightful stuff there. I was particularly intrigued by things like the impact on the attractiveness of the local landscape, not something that I would have immediately sprung to mind as someone who comes from the city rather than the country. So thank you for that. We'll take questions for Jackie at the end of the session, so we'll hear from David next. So over to you, please, David. Thank you very much.
G'day there, everyone. Yes, I'm David Younger, clinical psychologist. Thanks so much for joining this tune up session with the Red Cross. And look, what I'll say is the information that I share with you this morning, I certainly don't want to be coming across as telling you what's occurring in your work and your communities. I just want to share with you some key points that we've come to learn and understand along the way over the years in working with drought-affected communities and emergency-affected communities, and you can take from my material what you see as being appropriate and a good fit. Thanks also to Jackie for her information about wellbeing and resilience challenges in the drought cycle, and her focus in particular on the community perspective. What I'm going to do though, and being a psychologist by trade, is take more of an individual focus. So what I'm going to do is share with you the 101 of adaptability, prolonged stress and self-care, and look at that in the context of how to strengthen resilience when working through tough times like drought or the cumulative impact of other emergency and disaster events. Now, the thing here with adaptation is, and I just need to make this point at the beginning, is that there are multiple lenses really, or perspectives that we can use to look at adaptation. So I'm just going to lead you through a couple, but of course I'm coming at this predominantly from the perspective of psychological adaptation and from the perspective of the way in which individuals can adapt to tough times. So here's a perspective of biological adaptation. And it goes something like this, that evolutionary adaptation is the adjustment of organisms to their environment in order to improve their chances of survival in that environment. So it's about increasing the chance of survival. Now, psychological adaptation, on the other hand, can be defined as, or go something like this, the process by which humans sustain a balance in their mental and their emotional states of being and in their interactions. Just need to get rid of that comment, sorry, and in their, bear with me for a moment as I try to scroll back to the previous slide. There we go. So, psychological adaptation, the process by which humans sustain a balance in their mental and their emotional states of being and in their interactions with their social and their cultural environments. Now, here are what some others have said about adapting. So, Richard Branson, and gee, I wonder what he would be thinking at the moment in regards to his Virgin airline, of course, in the context of COVID-19. But he has said that adaptation, in regards to adapting, every success story is a tale of constant adaptation, revision, and change. And here's a well-known Chinese proverb, that the wise adapt themselves to circumstances as water molds itself to the pitcher. So you might start thinking about flexibility. And George Bernard Shaw, the famous playwright, once wrote that those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And as I was putting together this presentation, you know, I remembered a short trip last year up to Northern Victoria, where we ran a series of mental health and wellbeing sessions in drought-affected communities for local council. And, you know, very, very interestingly, we had some ex-farmers come along who are now working with council and working in other sort of emergency management related roles. And it was really interesting to hear their first-hand stories about practical out there farming adaptations. And, you know, they started to talk about the way in which, and they gave some very clear examples of how in the context of recent events, there were farms and farmers that had been able to adapt to significantly reduced rainfall, sort of in line with that drought cycle that Jacki was talking about, and others that hadn't. And what struck me as I listened to the stories about those farmers who had experienced significant challenge in the context of being able to adapt was that they were being impacted and affected negatively by significant levels of stress and pressure. And that seemed to be taking its toll on their ability to do those things psychologically, mentally and emotionally that are necessary in order to work through an adaptive process. So let me give you some examples of psychological adaptation, just two here, and there are of course many, but one relates to a person, an individual experiencing an unexpected event. And it might go something like this, that if a person experiences something that's unexpected, they need to be able to manage their emotional state and perhaps emotions of surprise so that they can actually focus their attention on the particular situation. In fact, they would probably need to be able to stop, to orient themselves to that particular situation, to assess what's occurring in that particular situation, to manage their emotions, and then to adapt to that particular situation and to implement a series of actions. Now, just hold that in your mind and let me take you through one other example, and that relates to significant loss, material or other. So a person that experiences significant loss of material or other, we know and understand well that the nature of human functioning is that people will typically experience varying emotions, sadness or anger, for example, and that these need to be worked through at some point. They can't be avoided forever. And in order to work through them, people have to not become overwhelmed. Now, this means that people need to have the ability to recognize the experience they're having, to understand the experience they're having, to feel emotions, to be able to evaluate or reevaluate their circumstances in order to then adapt and implement actions. And you see, essentially what I'm getting at here with this section is that in order to adapt, humans need to have access to adequate mental and emotional resources. We only have so much energy. We only have so much capacity for psychological and emotional experiences. And once we reach our limit or go beyond our limit, our ability to adapt to changing circumstances will become limited. In fact, we will probably go backwards very, very quickly. And the link here, or the segue, is that prolonged stress really prevents access to emotional and mental resources that are necessary for the adaptive process. So this will all become a lot clearer as I move on shortly into the second section, where I talk a little bit more about prolonged stress. But now let me touch on this word resilience. I think it's very, very, very important that we do this, because the word is used quite frequently and quite commonly. And what I've come to understand, I guess over the years more recently, is that resilience really is a word that has multiple meanings, and the meaning is very much context dependent. What I'd like to suggest here is that there are a series of links between adaptation, prolonged stress, self-care, and resilience. But a starting point, I think, is to perhaps take into consideration three perspectives of resilience. Now, one could be, for example, that resilience is evidenced by achieving better than expected outcomes in high-risk groups of people or communities. So we might typically think of communities that have been exposed to a prolonged period of drought. That in itself would be enough, never mind the impact or effect of cumulative events like bushfire or COVID-19. But then secondly and importantly, think about this: maintaining effective functioning, which requires adaptability under highly adverse conditions, versus regaining or retaining effective functioning, which requires adaptability under adverse conditions. And my emphasis here is on the second and the third considerations, maintaining effective functioning and regaining or attaining effective functioning. Those, to me, in the context of drought, prolonged stress, self-care and well-being are fundamentally important for individuals to maintain and to even strengthen their capacity to respond resiliently. So what does all of this mean? And these are probably the take-home messages, or these are the take-home messages from this section. Well, what all of this means is that human adaptation requires change. Adaptation cannot occur without change taking place. And that psychological adaptation has to be supported by access to adequate mental and emotional resources, but prolonged stress prevents access to adaptive resources. Therefore, and following on from that, adaptation is actually an inherent feature of resilient responding. Resilience involves adaptation. And then the link here with self-care, and you might have heard of the mantra leisure and pleasure. The fundamental importance of self-care is that it helps to preserve and it helps to replenish resources, mental and emotional resources, as well as physical, which are, of course, inherently important to support adaptive functioning. So let me touch on now prolonged stress and just draw some links here, because it is important that we get just a very brief overview of the physiology and the psychology of prolonged stress. Now, I don't want to make this too technical by any means, and in fact, I just have a few slides here. But what I do want to let you know is that, again, there are a number of perspectives that we can draw on to look at prolonged stress. And one of those is GAS, or General Adaptation Syndrome, which comes from the work of an early 1900s Viennese endocrinologist. And it is actually because of his work and his pioneering studies that we have the word stress in the English language. And essentially, and long story short, what he did was identify 3 stages of stress, all of which start out with good health or homeostasis, which means that everything in the body is in balance and is actually working in the way that it should. However, the important point to make here is that good health or homeostasis is supported by adaptive functioning within the human body. We stay cool on a hot day because the body adapts by sweating, and then as the sweat dries, the body is cooled. And the body has hundreds of adaptive mechanisms. But in terms of stress, 3 stages: alarm stage, think, fight, flight, or freeze; resistance stage, which is equivalent to prolonged stress; and then the stage that we don't want people and communities to get to, exhaustion stage. That's the end point of having been in either of the 2 prior stages, although usually the second, resistance stage, too intensely and for too long. And this is what many drought-affected communities unfortunately experience. So I'm going to focus purely on stage 2, resistance stage or prolonged stress, and just say to you that ordinarily, after there has been a big threat, something like a bushfire or a significant period of drought, when that period of significant threat comes to an end, the body does what it does best, and it returns to a state of relative comfort zone, or to that homeostatic or balanced state. However, it's not always the case that the threat subsides. And in fact, in terms of droughts are not like bushfires where the event comes and goes quickly for a day or 2, or for a week or 2 for that matter. And of course, all of you will understand this and be aware of this. Drought occurs over a prolonged period of time. And with the body being such a fantastically adaptive mechanism, what it does is it adapts to the persisting and ongoing stresses that humans, that individuals face. And it makes a series of changes in the body which enable people to access energy that they wouldn't normally have access to. And they need this energy because they're facing continuing challenges and difficulties. The underlying chemical in the body that actually fuels the prolonged stress state, or this resistance stage, is cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. Again, entering into a prolonged state of stress in the context of drought is the human body working to do what it does best, to adapt, to enable a person to face challenges, to work through and to get through tough times. But unfortunately, what we know and understand well about the prolonged stress state, and in particular about cortisol, is that it leaches energy, or it depletes energy from the human body, from vital systems and from vital organs. And inevitably, at some point, if people don't come out of the prolonged state of stress, they will run out of energy. They'll hit that exhaustion stage or phase. Although before they reach exhaustion, various health and well-being issues will start to emerge. Various sicknesses, physical and also psychological or mental, start to emerge as well. If there are cumulative events, and of course we also know and understand this is occurring, unfortunately, more frequently in Australia at the moment, think drought, bushfire, COVID, then there is the tendency for people to be driven into a deeper state of resistance or into a more prolonged state of stress. It's not only about the body being depleted of energy reserves and people becoming unwell. Prolonged stress is also associated with people's mental functioning, their psychological functioning being reduced, and reduced in such a way that they're not able to perform many of the important functions that are associated with facing drought. So, for example, and this is to do with the way in which brain functioning is impacted by the prolonged state of stress, people generally experience a reduced capacity for problem solving. They also lose the capacity to think creatively and to plan into the future. Essentially, we're biologically hardwired when we're in a highly stressed state to focus on problems and challenges. We lose sight of the bigger picture. We don't think long term. We're just focused on what's occurring in the moment. Regrettably, as well, there's an increased tendency for people to become judgmental and to jump to conclusions, or to enter into a frame of mind where they're in a constant state of looking out for what the next threat or the next problem is. We see people that are more emotionally volatile and reactive. We see personal relationships start to become degraded and to suffer. And overall, essentially, people's adaptive mechanisms are reduced. Their capacity to change and adapt in a flexible way to challenging circumstances is lessened. So what does this mean in terms of self-care, defining self-care and well-being? And I noticed, I think that Jackie and I use the same definition, which is great. So all I am going to do is to say that well-being is a state of being well. Self-care relates to the strategies or the practices in particular, and I really emphasize this, the habits and the routines that people form and embed in their day-to-day lives that assist in creating and maintaining a state of well-being. We can't experience well-being unless we're practicing self-care. And what I really encourage people and communities to do is to focus on adopting a preventative model versus a sickness model that is all too frequently, unfortunately and regrettably, it takes people becoming unwell to turn to self-care. But what we would really prefer people to do is to start implementing self-care practices now in order to promote well-being and hopefully to avoid becoming unwell. So what I would say is that self-care skills, it's not a case of you have them or you don't. It's just a case of whether you learn them and whether you strengthen them over time. And if I just now take you back to my first section where I spoke about adaptation and change, and then secondly about prolonged stress, where self-care fits in, or leisure and pleasure, moments for leisure and pleasure, is that they create opportunities for the body to rest and recover. Opportunities to rest and recover is absolutely vital to promote that return to homeostasis and balance. So in fact, what self-care practices do, irrespective of the technique essentially, is that they aim to limit prolonged periods of high stress. People who are constantly working, having limited time to relax at the end of the day before going to bed. And if you're highly stressed, by the way, you'll typically have a poor quality sleep, maybe wake up early in the morning and be unable to get back to sleep, and then sort of head off for the next day and just repeat that over and over and over again. that's completely contrary to promoting a state of health and well-being in the human body. And as a person becomes cumulatively more and more fatigued and tired, their adaptive capabilities are reduced. So self-care is all about preserving healthy, balanced functioning for the duration, fueling yourself up to run a marathon as opposed to running a sprint. Now, there are a plethora of, an absolute myriad of self-care areas and techniques. I have taken, really just a tiny couple in comparison to what's out there. But what I do also want to let you know is that there is good scientific evidence now to show that certain self-care strategies contribute to stress tolerance. So if you practice self-care, you're sort of arming yourself up to become at least a little bit inoculated to experiencing stresses or shocks or prolonged stress. But maybe we could think about types of self-care as fitting into one of four areas: physical, emotional, social, and community. You can have a look through these slides afterwards and look at the varying examples of self-care techniques I have included for each of these particular sections. And I noticed with interest one of Jacki's slides, which showed that 42% of people experiencing drought-affected communities, spent less time socialising with friends and family. And then the factor that was most important was community connectedness. So again, think about the relevance of self-care as investing time in relationships and connecting with community, because we know that promotes an increased capacity to work through tough times. Thanks, everyone. That's my snapshot overview of those three key topics. I'll hand back over to Andrew.
That's been fantastic and very insightful. Thank you, David. So thank you to both Jacki and David. It strikes me from both the presentations that clearly drought is not so much an event as a constant cycle, and a constant cycle of change requiring constant adaptation by all who are impacted and all who are involved. Stating the obvious in some ways, but I think nice to have that really highlighted for us. One of the great challenges, I think, is that the attention and indeed the support and the funding mechanisms all tend to be driven by the public face of the driest period of drought, as opposed to some of the insights that we had from both Jacki and David about the cyclical nature and the before and after. Unlike a bushfire or a flood or a cyclone, we don't have that event where it ends and then we move to another phase very quickly. It tends to be a gradual process that differs from area to area, and that, I guess, is one of the things that we're dealing with at the moment in some of the communities that you're all involved in or living in. Also very interested in the links David drew between the physical and the emotional. I think, we all know that at a subconscious level, but to have that highlighted, I think, was really particularly useful, and that interaction that leads to overall well-being, both physically and mentally. So thank you to both Jacki and David again. An opportunity now for some questions. And Alex, I think you have been capturing those questions as we've gone, or plucking them out of the chat box there. I wonder if you would care to provide a couple of those to our two presenters, please.
Yes, so we've got a few. First one is, thank you ever so much for the presentation. This is from Bernie, and says that Jacki, the drought cycle stuff that you were talking about really resonated with her. And mentioned often we go from prolonged drought, which is ended by heavy flooding, and had another comment that, sometimes you hear the comment, there's more money in mud, but that actually is really tough, like seeing the land wash away. So it really is going back to those cumulative stuff. How, does the drought ended by heavy flooding, how does this impact on well-being?
Yeah, and look, that's one example of many where we can see different endings to drought, if you like. So another classic thing that sometimes happens is that those first couple of years after drought, the rainfall patterns are odd. So people see crops washed out by a heavy rainfall, or there's an unusual frost, things like that. In terms of wellbeing, from a policy perspective, the challenge we see is that a lot of support programs end too early and fail to recognise that you've got ground that's very vulnerable, and that anything like a bushfire or flood can cause a lot of damage. And so then you get the flood assistance program coming in that sort of gets all messy. So if we can do anything we can do to combine support so that people get more consistent support over time is really important. The other one is from the perspective of supporting people, just recognizing that this is happening is absolutely critical. And I think that's something we can do a lot better at, so that people feel able to say, here's what's happening to me. So that's probably not very much to say there, but yeah, it's recognizing this is happening, making sure we keep our support up and that we don't just assume rain is always good. We're seeing down, you know, I live in Canberra, down friends who are farming down the south coast of New South Wales have had in the last year to deal with drought, bushfire, flood. And they're just saying, well, and then I'm asked to apply for different sorts of support for all of it. So we need to do better at coordinating and supporting people through all those things.
Thanks, Jackie. And I suppose, David, you might be able to add to that what the impact is having on wellbeing. But we also had a similar question around COVID, so you might be able to link both in. You know, a question that says early days yet, but what evidence is there of the impact of COVID on top of drought, similar to how, you know, often big floods can end drought? So what's the impact on well-being, David? I don't know if you had anything to add.
Look, I don't have any, I haven't come across any evidence yet about the impact of COVID on top of drought, but, you know, in regard to the first question, and we could perhaps start to think that maybe we will see a certain thing in drought-affected communities. But so when drought is broken by rain and flooding in particular, look, I would come at this from the individual stress responding perspective, and, you know, take people back to that three-stage model of fight, flight, resistance, and exhaustion, and suggest that, and let you know that what we've seen occur quite frequently is that community members have been in that prolonged state of cortisol stress without having really much awareness that that's the state they've been in. They're incredibly tired and fatigued. You know, their functioning has been significantly compromised. Then the flooding occurs, and depending upon the significance or the material impact, they can be catapulted back up into an adrenaline state. They're already very tired and fatigued, and what we know can happen from a mental health perspective is that not only do people become anxious, they can become very low and depressed. And that can be really quite disconcerting and confusing for people, because on the one hand, the drought has come to an end, there's been a lot of rain, but they're still feeling incredibly unwell. So, you know, if people have experienced cumulative stress, we know their health and well-being is compromised, and rain, and in particular flooding, you know, is quite possibly going to increase the chances of their well-being being degraded. So I would just sort of see COVID as an additional cumulative stress on top of everything else. Maybe not the virus for rural communities, maybe it'll be more the financial impact, you know, and the disruption to pre-existing routines and systems and structures.
Thank you both. And I'll move swiftly on to try and get another couple of questions in. Easy question to say, but probably harder to answer. What role can councils play in planning and preparation when it comes to the drought?
Yeah, so there is a lot councils can do, but there's also the challenge that a lot of people in councils are not given much support to provide support. So I'd start by saying one of the things we probably need to focus on more is making sure local councils have the resources they need to provide support, because often they're the first people who are seeing some of these signs of stress. So having that improved coordination can be really good. One thing I've certainly observed that some communities have actively reported to us as being really useful is when council has a policy that looks forward to what they'll do when there's different levels of rainfall deficiency, and actually have a policy of here's the types of things we'll roll out. That can be really helpful. We certainly found that councils that are very active in partnering with not-for-profit organisations and bringing in support from them early and coordinating between them, that coordinating role can be really critical, making sure, you know, who's in your community trying to provide help, how can you put them together to make that more effective? That can be really, really critical. And probably the other one is we did a study a few years ago looking at a previous drought in Tasmania, when we went in after Drought, 2 years after, and said, what was the most helpful thing that was done for you? We were talking specifically to farmers in that one. Without almost all of them said, it was a time the council sent a bus around to pick us up to go to a barbecue, because we didn't have to try and put petrol in the car. We didn't have to bring food or do anything. And we sort of had to interact, and just learning that everyone else was experiencing the same thing and talking together really helped. It goes back to that social connection. So council can sometimes play a really important role in helping people maintain their social connections. But a little bit of caution there, we don't want people to also try and overstretch. Councils are often overstretched already.
Thank you, Jackie. And just to acknowledge, we're getting quite a few questions through, so unfortunately we won't be able to ask them all. I'll go in for one last question now, and the rest of the questions we will compile and do a write-up and send them out to you. So last question for now, and it was also a remaining question from last time. Maybe David, this could be focused to you. What strategies could we employ to support community members who don't necessarily acknowledge the strain they're under? Any strategies that we can employ to talk to them about it?
Yeah, well, look, I think, and some of you will have heard this before, but I think we need to start with the fundamental premise that communication is the concrete tool that we have to work with. Communication comes in many forms, of course, written, verbal, just as two examples. So what I'd suggest works quite well generally is that we identify the pre-existing communicational pathways or networks within a community, and then we get creative about how we penetrate them. So we don't have to go and build a new website or create a new Facebook page. Often they already exist within a community. We just have to find them. And then we need to have a way to compile information that is simple and easy to understand, that we can feed through those resources with, of course, the help of community. We need to enrol people in this process and have their cooperation. And then, I think if we're able to do that, we just need to set our expectations accordingly and just initially take the view that all we're working to do is to work to raise people's awareness, in particular to bring their and to bring them back into contact with themselves. When people are stressed, their focus is on what's occurring outside of their body. It's on the problems. What we want to do is bring their awareness back into contact with themselves, and just help them understand, for example, these 3 phases of stress, and how they actually impact and affect. And if we repeat the messages gradually over time in a community, there will be people in the community that pick it up and understand it, and they will, and we need to encourage people to do this, share it with other community members as well.
Thanks, David. I think a really good point in which to end the discussion. Unfortunately, we can't get through the other questions, but as Alex mentioned, we'll do a compilation and share some more information with you via email. Those practical issues, I think, really highlighted for me, in particular, the way in which services might be provided to communities who aren't typically used to availing themselves of the sorts of service a lot of us provide. So I think there's a key message in there, and Jackie touched on it as well, with those very practical things of just the outings and the opportunity to get amongst other community members and spend some time. Can I very quickly again thank both Jackie and David for their efforts this morning. I think really insightful, really informative, not only professionally but also personally, I think, for a lot of us, hopefully most of us. And a quick acknowledgement as well to Alex Tanfield and Alex Ralph, who are the 2 Red Cross people who pulled together this Drought webinar series, which continues on in a couple of weeks' time. In 2 weeks, we will be looking at the next of the webinars, so we look forward to hopefully having you all joining us for that as well. If you're after more details of some of the Drought program that Red Cross is offering, and that talks about the webinar and future webinars, please go to contact drought@redcross.org.au, or alternately head to our webpage and just type in Red Cross Drought Program, and you'll find some more information and resources there, and we've got some of that detail on screen at the moment. The topic for the next of our webinars is wellbeing after the rains, something that we started to explore today, but obviously we'll go into a lot more detail in a couple of weeks' time. I would recommend that to you. And just finally, the other thing that we'll be doing is sending you an email with the recording, or at least a link to the recordings on our webpage, and also inviting you to fill in a short 1-minute survey if you would. It helps us to keep focused on the sorts of things that people want to hear about and talk about over the coming weeks and months. So again, thank you to all involved, to our 2 speakers in particular. Thank you all for your time in these challenging times that we're living in and through. Please take care of yourself, and we look forward to connecting again in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much.